Hello everyone, I'm Jack Fisher and welcome to my world. I'd like to start this video out by asking a simple question. What goes into making a character iconic? Now by iconic, I don't just mean the kinds of characters who make it onto lunchboxes, billboards, and children's pajamas. Most don't deny that Spider-Man, Superman, Wolverine, and Wonder Woman are pop culture icons. Characters like that have long since transcended the superhero media from which they were born. But those characters are icons on a very different level. It's still possible for certain characters to become iconic in their own unique way, becoming more than just passing fads or forgettable stories from a certain era. It's just the exception and not the norm. They may start out as unremarkable, they may never even aspire to become icons. But somehow, they find a way to grow and blossom into something so much more. Many aspiring writers and creators try to create these iconic characters, but only a handful have ever succeeded in the grand scheme of things. And sometimes, you just know a character is poised to become something special. It's hard to quantify. It's kind of like being in love. You can't explain it, you just know it. And when you've consumed as much superhero media as I have, you tend to notice the signs more than most. In that spirit, I want to talk about a character who became an icon in her own right, but through unexpected means. I also want to highlight those critical details that convinced me that she was going to become a huge star. And that character is X-23, also known as Laura Kinney. Now, I've talked about her before. Her origin comic, Innocence Lost, has a prominent place in my Jack's Comics Gems playlist. But in that same video where I praised the comic, I pointed out an important detail about this character. Unlike Spider-Man, Superman, and most of the X-Men, she did not make her debut in the comics. She first showed up in an episode of X-Men Evolution, one aptly titled X-23. And this episode, this simple 22-minute cartoon from the early 2000s, introduced this character to the world. But one episode was all it took, both for me and for the character's spectacular rise to stardom. And if you go back and watch that episode, which I highly encourage everyone to do, it's easy to see now why X-23 stood out so much. To appreciate the episode itself, it's also important to appreciate the show it debuted on. X-Men Evolution is a great show that's held in high regard by many X-Men fans, myself included. However, it's one of those shows that always gets outshined by its predecessor. In this case, it was the 90s animated series. That's the show all X-Men cartoons get compared to, but even if it was never going to succeed on the same level as that show, X-Men Evolution still found a way to shine. It took a very different approach from the 90s show, and even the comics. It basically rebuilt and retold the story of the X-Men, having the main character start out as teenagers in high school, dealing with teen melodrama more than Sentinels. It was a very different approach to telling the X-Men story, but it still worked. I would even argue its greatest strength was embracing that teen melodrama, letting that supplement the typical path of a superhero story. And in that sense, X-Men Evolution was the perfect place for X-23 to debut. Sure, the same story could have been told in the comics, but it just wouldn't have had the same impact. That's because one of X-23's most defining traits is that she was denied a childhood. In both the show and the comics, this is the catalyst for her story. She was not created to be someone's child. She was not created out of love, lust, hate, or deception. She was created to be a tool, a weapon for the highest bidder and nothing more. Much like Wolverine, she was supposed to be the ultimate living weapon. No humanity, no conscience, no persona whatsoever. Now, it's one thing to inflict that sort of conditioning on someone like Wolverine, but to do that to a child, that takes things to a whole nother level. But what makes it work so well in X-Men Evolution is that most of the X-Men are still kids for the most part. But by and large, these are kids and teenagers who are still growing into the heroes we know and love. And by this point in the show, we've seen them grow a great deal. We can see the signs of the strength as well as the flaws of what will come to define these characters. But then X-23 enters the picture, a character we know nothing about. But from the beginning, we know she's important. We know she's capable. In the opening scene of the episode, we see that on full display. Now, initially, we don't know she's just a child. We don't even know she's a girl. We just see this masked figure infiltrating a secure facility with brutal cunning, all to get intel on a single target, Wolverine. Now, she's not the first one to go after him in the show. She's not even the fifth. But even before we know who X-23 is, we also know that her vendetta against him is very personal. While all this is going on, the episode goes out of its way to remind us that Wolverine's ability to relate to kids is still limited at best. In this show, he's more teacher and a mentor. He attempts to train these young X-Men to fight in a world that's going to find reasons to attack them. But at the same time, they're still kids, and they're going to act like kids, much to his annoyance. It frames Wolverine as this guy who doesn't know how to connect with kids at first. And that's to be expected. His life is nothing like theirs. He's still the same grizzled mutant with big gaps in his memory, but he's trying to be something other than what Weapon X made him. And in previous episodes of the show, we've seen him connect with the younger X-Men to some extent. But he's still very much defined by his own personal demons. Then suddenly, he learns about X-23 through S.H.I.E.L.D. And now he's facing something unlike anything he's ever encountered. And unlike many other of those threats, this isn't one he can hope to beat with his claws. This is also where we learn that X-23 is both a child and a clone of Wolverine. Now, keep in mind, characters who are clones have a less than stellar track record, especially when it comes to superheroes. When this episode came out, most Marvel fans still remember the dark days of the Spider-Man clone saga, so the idea of a Wolverine clone was risky to say the least. But X-23 gave us a story that few clones had had to that point. For one, she looks nothing like her predecessor. She's a girl and a child. She's not one of those characters who could stand next to Wolverine and you'd struggle to tell them apart. She also has some distinct features of her own, namely having 2 claws instead of 3, plus an extra claw in each foot. That may seem like a minor distinction, but make no mistake, those details count when you're making a new character, especially one who's a clone of another. But X-23 presented us with a perfect balance with respect to appearance and demeanor. But it was really the tragic nature of her story that really stood out. We see it when Dr. Deborah Rissman tells her story, as well as the tragic recordings of her conditioning. This girl was literally denied everything. All that life and growth we saw in the other young X-Men characters, she didn't just miss out, it was taken from her. And when Wolverine expresses abject disgust, we the audience feel it too. And again, this is a kids show, but that only serves to intensify the impact even more, because whether we're adults or kids ourselves, we can feel the weight of this hardship. It sets the stage for a confrontation between Logan and X-23. But before we get to that, we learn just how dangerous and cunning this girl can be. We see X-23 subdue the entire X-Men single-handedly. She doesn't use lethal force, she just knocks them out. But it's abundantly clear she could have done much worse if she wanted. But taking out the X-Men was never her primary goal. It was always about confronting Wolverine, the man she blamed for her existence, the man she held responsible for all the suffering she endured. It eventually plays out in one of the most dramatic scenes we ever got in X-Men Evolution, if not in any animated series to that point. X-23 keeps fighting him with this uncanny tenacity, her anger and determination on full display. The fact that she's a child and she's capable of all this, that just makes it all the more impressive. The true crux of this scene isn't just in how she demonstrates her skills, it's in how Wolverine fights back, or more accurately, chooses not to. That in and of itself is remarkable, because over the course of this show, we've seen him eagerly throw himself at his enemies, and he never hesitates to growl, grunt, or attack anyone who gets in his way. And yet here he is, hesitating to fight back. It's one kind of battle that he is not equipped to handle. Talking to an enraged child, his child no less. He can't take her down like he would Sabretooth, Magneto, or any other enemy. He might be the best there is at what he does, but what he does isn't this. With each attack, we see X-23 growing more and more upset. She doesn't believe him when he said he didn't know about her. And she doesn't see him as the man who provided the DNA that made her. She just sees the source of all her pain and rage. It's tragic, it's heartbreaking, and yet it's understandable when coming from a damaged child. And nobody understands that better than Wolverine. Moreover, he might be the only one who understands it. He says as such during the battle, but he also says he's the closest thing to family she's got. And it's that statement that changes everything for X-23. It affects her so profoundly that it changes the nature of the fight. Suddenly, we see her go from this rage-filled living weapon to a child desperately in need of familial love. She fights it at first. She even starts crying, something that she wasn't supposed to be capable of doing. But eventually, she completely breaks down, and Wolverine is there to catch her. And it was that moment, that one defining scene, which sealed X-23's status as a future star. It might not have made her an iconic character all at once, but it set her on the right path. Anyone who watched that episode sensed it. I distinctly remember going on message boards after that episode aired, and the consensus among the fans was undeniable. They loved this character, they felt the dramatic weight of her story, and they wanted to see more of her. Now, comic fans rarely agree on much, but when we see a character like this in an episode like this, we can all acknowledge the importance of this development. Marvel certainly got the message. After that episode aired, it wasn't long before X-23 started showing up in the comics. Fittingly enough, the showrunners of X-Men Evolution, Craig Kyle and Chris Yost, got to flesh her story out even more. And she's only become more compelling ever since, eventually going on to steal the show in the Logan movie. But it all began with that one fateful episode of X-Men Evolution. To this day, it still defines X-23 as both a character and a story. Even though she goes by Laura Kinney now, and has since distanced herself from her X-23 designation, she's become her own icon. While she'll always be tied to Wolverine's story, she's still found a way to stand out. This fateful episode of X-Men Evolution laid the foundation, and so many other wonderful things have been built upon it ever since. For that reason, this episode will always have special meaning for fans. And on behalf of those fans, to Craig Kyle, Chris Yost, and all those behind X-Men Evolution, thank you. Thank you for giving us X-23. And thank you for giving us this truly uncanny icon. Thanks for watching, everyone. And thanks for joining me in my world. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And until next time, take care and stay safe.